How horrid is this war, brother against brother, and the parent against the child? 'Tis pity the little time we have to spend in this world we cannot enjoy ourselves and our friends, but must be devising means to destroy each other. Lucy Knox, 1777. Welcome to the revolution. Hello and welcome to We Need a Revolution. My name is Kevin Rosenquist, and this guy over here is John Banks. John, welcome.
Why, thank you. How are you doing today or this evening? Or I don't, depends on what time in the world you're listening to this.
You know, John, we talked a little bit on the pregame about I've been reading way too much about what's happening in Iran today, and it's a fucking disaster, man. I mean, it is. I just can't even believe some of the stuff that I'm reading. It's mind blowing. You know, schools bombed and innocent people. It's just so crazy, and and to hear the people justifying it is, I don't know. So it's one thing I've noticed for people listening. You have to understand, John and I, we are generally up on what's going on in the world, but we're really up on what's going on in the world now because of this show. And there are times where I read so much that I get into this funk, man. I was in a funk earlier.
Which makes sense, and I think the solution to that is either whiskey or don't read. So that's.
I'm going to choose whiskey because I was going to do that anyway. Let's be honest.
Yeah. Well, I was reading a couple of senators and a couple of Congress or people from the House. Basically had a meeting today or walked out of a meeting with Trump, and they were basically like, he has no plan, right? So. I mean, you can get, I'm not a constitutional scholar, I read things that say it's illegal and this is, and I do know that Congress has that they are the ones who enact war. But I will say that, we have a lot of like wars, that were considered military actions that didn't have congressional approval. But, I don't know. We'll see where it goes, man. It is crazy. And it is sad, right?
It's very sad.
Yeah,
it's very sad. I mean, there's almost 200 school children that should still be alive. I mean, it's crazy. That's just crazy. It's crazy that's not. It's more. It seems like it's not appalling enough to some people, and that I think is what kind of scares me. But it's it is what it is. We're here right now, and
we are.
How's your day going? Are you good?
My day is good. I've been moving, as you know,
right.
for the last 17 years, and it's been a while. So I moved over the weekend, and repaired everything in the old apartment, and so I'm just slowly unpacking stuff. So my apartment, you can't really see, is just chaos still, but every day I'm just chipping away. So I'm trying to make a living while doing it. So
that's all you can do, John.
Other than your depressing news, what do you think of the economy right now? Because
Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. You're right, and just a reminder to everybody who's listening. We get new people every week, so please subscribe to our channel. We very much appreciate the subscription, and this is a live show, so feel free to comment, to ask questions. We're happy to pass those along to our guest and get some questions answered for you. It's what we're here for. We want to educate. We want to bring on people that'll help people look at things in a little different light. So if you have questions, please put them in there. And again, please subscribe. We very much appreciate it. I don't know, John. I mean, the economy is booming, I guess. Like, I don't know. Like, that's what everybody says. But I have a question for you. Have you ever been unemployed before?
I have, yeah.
Where you had to file for unemployment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like 2002, 2003, something like that. And
how long do you remember?
I think I did 7 months or 8 months. Yeah, something like that. I got laid off. So, and I will say unemployment is not a lot of money.
No. It's
it is definitely, it's very interesting to me. And I understand it's a safety net, but it's a safety net that I guess is to make sure you can eat, but not really pay rent. Not much else. It was,
especially in LA.
Yeah, especially in LA.
It makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, I do know that that's one of the reasons I moved is basically I was living in an apartment that cost a lot of money, and it just didn't make sense anymore, and and it's like and to find something cheaper in LA is not easy. Like there is no cheap in LA, right? There's less expensive, but so I'm definitely feeling the crunch of this economy, and I wish I was a billionaire because those guys are doing fantastic.
They don't seem to have any problems,
Yeah.
know.
Just
So
money keeps going up and up
the
and up.
money just keeps coming in. All right.
How about you? Have you ever been laid off?
I haven't been laid off. No, I have not been out of work for any length of time. The only thing it would have been is if I was between jobs or something like that, and but whatnot. But no, I haven't ever had to go through that. I've watched other people go through that, and it's not a huge amount of fun. And why don't we go and bring out our guest?
Yeah,
to talk
let's
more
do it.
about this, because he knows a hell of a lot more about this than we do. Certainly,
I would say 99.99% more.
more. I would go higher.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know the word economy.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, I know words sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, yeah, let's bring him out. So our guest today is an economist and the international best-selling author of Outrageous Fortunes and the mind behind the High Yield Economics newsletter. He recently put out a terrifying report warning that for most workers, the economy is in a dismal and dangerous place. He's here to break down exactly how corporations are making record profits by squeezing the life out of the working class, and how the government is helping them to do it. So please welcome. Let me bring him, Daniel Altman. Dan, how are you?
I'm doing great, gents. How are you?
I can't complain. Well, except for what we already complained about in the opening.
Fair enough.
Well, I'm really glad to have you here, Dan. I reached out to you after I read an alarming report that you had put up on LinkedIn in your newsletter about long-term unemployment. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, the media keeps telling us that everything's booming, but you're kind of saying that it's not that's not like that. Like we're being kind of duped in a lot of ways. And I believe the stat was that the poorest 20% of Americans lost like 9.3% of their purchasing power in the past 3 years. So can you kind of talk about why there's such a massive disconnect and what kind of prompted you to do this research?
Sure. The big issue here, I think, is that the illusion that comes from the labor market doesn't necessarily convey what people are actually feeling. The labor market's telling us that almost everybody who wants a job has a job. Unemployment rate, though it has gone up a bit over the last year or two, is historically low. And yet we know that people are struggling. How do we square that circle? And the answer has to do a lot with purchasing power. You may have a job, you may have income, but if your income is not keeping up with prices, then you're having problems. And we know that there was a long period where inflation was very rapid and people did find that they were falling behind. Some of those people caught up, but a lot of those people didn't. And the people who are having the worst time of it tend to be the people on the lower incomes. And again, this is not something that has happened just overnight. We've seen for really decades a decline in labor bargaining power, and that has meant that the people who work for a living don't necessarily share as much in the spoils of the economy as the people who own capital. So we're just seeing kind of symptoms of this situation, which are kicking up again right now. And as a result of that, the labor market really does produce sort of an elusive picture.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
So you're talking about the weakening of bargaining power, and so I grew up. My dad was a coal miner growing up, or well, he was coal miner when I was growing up, and they actually had a very strong union. So what do you think has been the reason that unions have weakened, and also just overall why has labor lost so much of its power?
Labor has really suffered a series of blows that are unprecedented in history, I think. One is deunionization. We used to have a much higher percentage of workers in this country who were part of unions, and now we're down around 10% or the teens, something like that if we're lucky. And that means that the vast majority of workers are not organized and they don't have the power to bargain collectively. They are bargaining on a one-person basis with whomever is their employer. So that obviously takes away a lot of bargaining power, right? On the one side of the table, you have corporations. On the other side, instead of having a relatively similar number of unions, you have millions and millions of workers who are each trying to bargain on their own. Second thing that happened was technological change. We saw more and more automation happening in the second part of the 20th century. And as a result of that, workers weren't just competing against each other, they were competing against machines as well. So that also eroded their bargaining power because machines were an alternative. Then we had globalization. And globalization meant that workers were now competing with other workers around the world, because if it was too expensive to produce in the US, you could produce somewhere else. So the amount of competition that workers were facing from each other, from machines, from workers around the world just kept increasing. And along the whole way, we had corporate consolidation, which means that companies were getting bigger and bigger. They were clumping up together through mergers and acquisitions. And this meant that there were actually fewer employers on the other side of the bargaining table. Now, anybody who studied bargaining knows that it's better to be fewer on your side of the table, right? Because you want people to have fewer alternatives to you when they're negotiating.
Right.
So when there are fewer employers, there aren't as many people that workers can go around and bargain with. They're stuck bargaining with this smaller number of employers, and that reduces their bargaining power too. So all these things have contributed to reduce labor's share of national income, the amount that goes to people who work for a living out of all the money that we earn as an economy. And that share has gone down by about 10, 15% over the past several decades. That's real money.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. I'm curious too. You mentioned the unions, and obviously they're not as many, they're not as plentiful, not as many people are involved in unions. Is that what do you see as the reason for that? Did corporations put a lot of work and effort into killing unions? Did it just not become a priority of the worker? What changed?
I think a couple things changed. When unions started out, they were really looking for basic things like workplace safety. They were trying to stop people from getting killed on the job, basically. Right. And then they wanted to get reasonable hours, things like that, just basic stuff that we take for granted today. And eventually, as those things started to become part of law and institutionalized throughout the labor market, then unions were primarily working to raise wages, and that was their essential function. And some people figured out that, well, maybe I would do better on my own. Instead of paying the union money to give me more money, I could just short circuit that process and just try and get more money myself. And you also had this situation where people became more like free agents, and they didn't necessarily want to go and pay union dues at every new job if they were switching jobs much more frequently. And that's something that was an increasing trend over time. So there was an aspect of unions becoming maybe not useful for as many things, and maybe not worth doing for some people who really wanted to have more flexibility. But on the other side, corporations really did try very hard to deunionize. Corporations broke up union shops. Corporations tried to hire the types of workers who wouldn't necessarily unionize. And so they worked very hard over many years to stop unionization in their shops. And they're still doing it today, obviously. You see stories about people trying to start up unions, and they're facing a lot of opposition, even getting fired in some cases for trying to start a union, which is not legal, but it happens anyway. So, it's been a combination of those factors.
Yeah, I've seen stories of that of that stuff as well. Somebody commented in here that one of the problems was that union leaders were more crooked than the companies. Which obviously power corrupts, money corrupts, all that stuff. Do you think that was a huge player in why unions aren't as prevalent?
Well, certainly there were a couple of big unions that were kind of contaminated by organized crime, and there was corruption at other unions.
I've seen The Irishman.
Yeah. That's only one thing you can see. But there were union bosses who were living high on the hog, and nobody really appreciated that. So certainly there were these things that contributed to a smaller popularity of unions. But there's still some unions that are quite strong and fairly well run, and they represent their workers in a forceful way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all unions have to be like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, like I said, my father, I know the coal miners union has really weakened over the last 30 years, and he retired decades ago, but he was, he still knows people in that industry, and he was saying, basically they are making today per hour what he was making 25 years ago. So because their unions have become so weak. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that happened, of course, was we had a big shift of employment from manufacturing to services. And manufacturing was a more obvious place to do organizing because everybody was there together in the factory, right? It was easy
Right.
to access everybody. They were all facing the same workplace conditions. But in service businesses, people can be very spread out. It's a lot harder to organize. And yet some of the best run unions that we have, the most effective unions that we have, are in services like SEIU or AFT. These are still operating at a very high level.
What do those unions represent? If you know, I don't know
Yeah.
what those are. So
Sure. AFT is American Federation of Teachers. So,
okay.
and SEIU represents a lot of different services. Can be clerical, can be health related. It's one of the biggest service unions that we have.
Oh, okay.
So without the strong unions, do you feel like workers have essentially lost the ability to demand a fair share?
It's much harder when you don't speak collectively with one voice. Then you're just a free agent and you're just trying to play off different employers against each other. And that's hard. So I think that, yes, it's just simple math, right? Anybody who studies bargaining, as I said, will tell you it's better to have fewer people on your side of the table because you want to be either close to a monopolist or close to a monopsonist, which would be a monopolist, but instead of for supply, for demand. And we're just so far away from that situation right now. Workers are completely atomized.
That sounds terrible.
So do you feel that corporations are using technology as a kind of a threat, because of the fact that this is sort of, obviously technology has changed the workforce, has changed, it changes things, it always has, but AI seems like it's on another level. Are they using that as leverage?
I don't know. I don't hear a lot of cases of people saying, take this contract, take this low wage, otherwise I'll replace you with a machine. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the thing that would be out of a John Henry story or something like that. But what more often happens is when companies feel like they're under pressure and they don't want to pay higher wages, then they start investing more in automation. And it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time for the infrastructure to be put down and the capital to be in place. So automation is not an instant solution, but they start thinking, maybe for the future, we need to invest more in automation. And this happened, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were labor shortfalls. I won't say shortages because, if you were able to offer much higher wages, you could get people in the door. Yep. But there were labor shortfalls at the wages that companies were used to paying. And so a lot of them said, no, this is the time to retrench and we're going to start investing more in automation. And that's actually a big part of the K-shaped economy that we're seeing now. It's not just AI, it's just all these run-of-the-mill automated processes that really started several years ago.
And when you say K-shaped economy, like what does that mean? What is?
Sure. I think that most people interpret it in the following way, which is that it seemed several years ago as though a rising tide would lift all boats. When people at the top end of the income spectrum got wealthier, then people at the bottom end were getting wealthier too. They were getting pulled along. But
is that the trickle-down economics?
Well, yeah. I mean, the fact of it was that people at the top end were actually shooting away from everybody else. But people at the bottom end were still getting pulled along to some degree. Mm-hmm. Now what we're seeing is the opposite. People at the top end are still shooting away, maybe even faster, but people at the bottom are actually doing worse, as we said earlier. Their purchasing power is actually going down. So that's the K, right? We're seeing some people go up while other people go down.
Got it. Okay. So it's a graph basically where, and then down. Right.
Yeah, we're going together and then we diverge. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm curious, as an economist, when people make the argument of, well, we can't raise wages because if we raise wages, then everything's going to go up and everything's already so expensive. So, why would we want to raise wages for people if then all that's going to do is just make everything so expensive? Is that sounds like a straw man argument, but is that, or, can you get into that?
Well, here's the thing. If you just try and raise wages, right? If you just put a zero on the end of everybody's salary, then yes, companies would say, oh, geez, our costs have gone way up. We need to increase prices, and they'll increase prices. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have a spiraling chain of wage increases and price increases, wage increases, price increases. But, some degree of higher wages are often translated into higher prices, except when labor gains bargaining power, because then it can get higher wages and the owners of companies need to accept lower profits, right? So there's a sort of push and pull there.
Okay.
The other thing that can happen is if workers gain productivity, then it's possible to pay them more because they're actually delivering more output without raising prices. So what we often see is in times of fast productivity growth, that's when workers are able to catch up a little bit. But we don't know if we're entering that period right now. Some people say AI is going to usher in this period of great productivity growth, but what if it does that at the cost of jobs? It'll be good for people who still have jobs, not so good for people who don't.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And there's, a lot of people talk about the skills gap too. Americans don't have the right skills for some modern manufacturing jobs, but you highlighted a crazy story from a Hyundai plant in Georgia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we have these cases where Americans don't have the right skills, and if technology is rapidly progressing, then it's harder for them to catch up and retrain so that they can find their niche in the labor market. And what we saw at the Hyundai plant in Georgia, where there was a big immigration raid, was that essentially the Hyundai company was saying we had to bring workers from Korea because Americans couldn't do these jobs. They weren't necessarily getting paid a heck of a lot less. So incomes in Korea are actually quite high. But they said, we're doing this out of necessity. At the very least, we need to have people here to train Americans to do these jobs. I don't know to what degree that was really true, or if they had other reasons to do this, if it was some sort of expediency. But they very quickly made it clear to the authorities that this plant wasn't going to be able to operate, and American jobs would be lost if they couldn't have their Korean employees as well.
Do you think that was legit?
I don't know. I haven't studied the particular operations of that plant. The thing that got them in trouble was that some people overstayed their visas or had the wrong type of visa.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't surprise me that they would want to have some of their Korean-based teams at that plant, especially when they're starting out. That's something that's quite common across many businesses. When you open a new branch, you sort of send your ninjas in to teach everybody what to do.
Absolutely.
When they're done, they move on to the next one.
I like that, ninjas. You're corporate ninjas. Got to get in there.
Yeah. Your elite squad.
Yeah. So when the Washington in 2025 passed the big beautiful bill, right, and they sold that as the it's going to be great for the middle class. It's going to make the economy boom. But you actually call that, I think you call that a sugar high. And so basically, could you kind of tell us why that's bad for the middle class and lower middle class and people? Well, basically, why is that bad for anyone who's not super wealthy?
Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was mainly an extension of the 2017 tax cuts. And we know that the 2017 tax cuts were highly slanted towards high-income people. And so, yes, there's an extension of tax cuts for lower and middle-income people as well. But what's happening is that inequality is going to grow as a result of this because higher-income people are going to do that much better. We also know that they took a lot of climate-related subsidies out of the budget through the bill, and those things will probably end up hurting all of us in the long term because we're not dealing with the externalities of all the pollution that we create. But essentially, this was a way to deliver more tax cuts for wealthy people. And the flip side of this, of course, was that there was no way to pay for it, that all of this was going to just keep adding to the national debt to the tune of probably around $4 trillion over 10 years. And a lot of that front loaded as well. And that is going to be a problem for all of us as well, because we're all going to have to pay it. And while we run these enormous deficits and have a huge debt, interest rates are going to stay pretty high because investors have a little worry in the back of their mind about the Treasury's ability to pay. So essentially, this was a big sop to wealthy people. And the administration came out and said, well, we're going to pay for it with tariffs. We're going to get tariff revenue instead. That's going to fill this hole. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, the tariffs are nowhere near enough to fill this hole. At the run rate that we were getting towards the end of last year, even if the tariffs had been declared legal and they'd been able to continue, we might have replaced something like $2 trillion out of the $4 trillion over the next 10 years, especially with the behavioral effects, because we weren't necessarily going to collect such big tariffs forever because companies are reorienting their supply chains to avoid the tariffs. Anyway, so it wasn't going to fill that hole. But what it was going to do was it was going to shift the burden of taxation towards people who buy imported goods. And the bigger share of your monthly budget that is, the more you're going to end up paying. And of course, the people who end up paying are the people who buy cheap imported goods and have that as a big share of their monthly budget. And those are lower income people. So the net effect of this was to shift the tax burden away from wealthy high earners towards lower earning people who buy a lot of cheap imported goods.
Have tariffs ever worked, right? Or, so in other words, when you're just doing if you're doing targeted tariffs, I guess that could be effective. But when you just have blanket tariffs, is that actually has there ever been an instance where that has been good for a country's economy?
There's a significant debate about that in economics circles. The place to start is really with the theory of comparative advantage in trade. And that basically just says, hey, if you're much better at doing something than somebody else, even in relative terms, then that's what you should be doing. And you should buy your other stuff from other people. And they should buy the stuff that you make from you. And that makes everybody better off as consumers. The people it hurts are the people who would have produced the other stuff in your country, right? Who are no longer doing that. They lose their jobs. They have to find something else. Right. But the theory shows mathematically that the gains to the people who benefit are bigger than the losses to the people who lose out. And so they can be compensated and still make everybody at least a little bit better off. The problem is we never do that, right? We have some trade adjustment assistance programs that are tiny and not very effective. We basically don't say to everybody who gets a cheap TV that's made in Korea or Taiwan, hey, you have to chip in a certain amount of money so that people who are not making TVs in the US can find other jobs. We don't do that. We don't do any of that redistribution. So that sort of optimal outcome, that first best solution from the theory, just doesn't exist. And in the second best, as one of my old professors, Jim Hines, used to say, anything can happen. Right? We don't know what's optimal in the second best. It's a crazy world where we're not really following the theory anymore. And so some level of tariffs might be optimal in the second best since we're not doing the distribution. The question is, where is that level and what should it apply to? There are a lot of countries that developed quite quickly in the second half of the 20th century that used what's called an import substitution model, where they would basically say, we're going to put big tariffs on imports. We're going to produce those things here instead to create lots of jobs, and we're going to export when we can. We're going to copy as much technology as we can from abroad, and we'll just make things more cheaply here. Countries like Korea and a place like Taiwan would really have benefited from that approach for some period of time. But after a while, what happens is these tariffs are protecting your industries in a way that makes them less competitive. They're not competing on an even basis with other countries that are producing similar things around the world. So, the tariffs kind of have an expiration date. You might use them in those early stages when you're trying to catch up to wealthier economies, but when you're really innovating at the frontier, they're not really helping you as much. And we got to say, the United States is at the frontier. We're one of the most innovative economies in the world, and we should be. So tariffs are less useful for us unless there's specific industries that we really feel like we need to protect as they get off the ground. That could be an argument for why we have heavy tariffs on Chinese electric cars, and they basically don't exist in this country. Mm-hmm. I don't think that necessarily applies anymore, but maybe once upon a time it did. And the bottom line of it is, hey, we're a very service-heavy economy, and we actually run trade surpluses for services. For manufacturing, yes, we run a deficit, but the question is, are there specific sectors of manufacturing where we need that type of protection?
Okay. We one of the things that we really wanted to get into was the long-term unemployment issue. And do you feel, first of all, can you talk a little bit about your concerns about long-term unemployment based on what you have in your newsletter, and also how things like the big beautiful, what is it?
Big beautiful bill.
One big beautiful bill.
Yeah.
How that could make it worse?
Yeah. So when we think about unemployment, there's something involved called hysteresis. You may not have heard this term before, but if you think of a rubber band, if you stretch that rubber band enough times, it basically doesn't come back the way it used to, right? It doesn't have the same elasticity. It kind of stays stretched. And we talk about this in the labor market with respect to unemployment, that people who spend longer and longer times on unemployment have a harder time getting back into the labor market, right? They're trying, but it's harder and harder the longer you're out there. And that's what I really worry about, is that these people who are long-term unemployed are essentially being left behind by the labor market. And as I said before, when technology is moving forward quickly, it's harder and harder for them to catch up, to get back into the swim of things. And we're seeing it now. Long-term unemployment is a higher share of the unemployed than it has been for many years. And so my concern is that this is what is happening. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it doesn't help, because when you have rising inequality, it's harder and harder for people at the bottom end to catch up, right? They're just not getting the opportunities. They don't have the resources. Everything that is moderated by money in the economy becomes harder for them to access, because wealthier people will always be first in line. So, anything that contributes to that inequality is also contributing to inequality of opportunity, and that's the last thing we need right now.
We had one comment that said, "War is the only thing we
manufacture now." Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned war, right? Because the Second World War was actually a great leveler in some respects. People experienced much more equality serving in the armed forces, where lots of people from different walks of life were thrown together. And we came out of that saying, hey, okay, there's a little bit more wind in the sails of a progressive movement for social reform. And also, we're going to have this GI Bill to make sure that soldiers can catch up with technological change in the economy. So, that actually was the spur for a feeling of national unity and solidarity that gave us some really great things. I don't know what's going to create that feeling of unity and solidarity now.
This podcast.
That's right.
That would be great. Wars are now fought much more by people from similar economic backgrounds, usually pretty working class. And so we're not building those bridges the way we used to, even in wartime.
Right. Which I think that was, like World War II, that was like a very unique time in American history, right? Because I believe in the Civil War, you could actually pay people to go to war for you if you had enough money. So I felt,
right.
So we've kind of come back to where we were 200 years ago.
Yeah. And in the Vietnam War, wealthier people found ways around it.
Right.
Our president might have been one of them.
What?
So we're talking about, is there a skills gap? I mean, because we're talking about long-term unemployment. Does this stem from a skills gap, from a lack of technological know-how, from being left behind, if you will?
I think part of it does. When we look at scores for high school students on international standardized tests, Americans tend to do pretty well in reading, but they tend to fall behind in math. We know that our academic system is not as vocationally oriented as those of other countries. Mm-hmm. We struggle with the idea of apprenticeships and learning on the job for young people as an alternative to higher education. And there's a lot of pay for play as well, right? Lots of private colleges that say they're going to give you a technical education, but are really just extracting a lot of money from you and putting you in debt. So we haven't been really great at that whole game. We're also in a situation where we have been falling behind to some degree in a lot of path-breaking technologies. There have been various studies that have shown that if you look at a dozen different path-breaking technologies, 20 years ago, the US was ahead of China in most of them. Now the US is behind in most of them. So we need to move a little bit faster. And that's what makes it even more puzzling that one of the things this administration has cut the most has been basic scientific research. Really the germ from which a lot of our technological advancement grows has been cut back significantly in the last year. And it's not just grants, it's staff in research institutions. And I feel like we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, these are some of the highest paying investments we can make as a society and the things that we really need the most right now.
So yeah, I'm sorry. It's just, oh man, so many questions. So what? So let's go back for a second to like talking about the $4.5 billion trillion windfall for the wealthy, right? And how that has affected like SNAP and Medicaid and other things that are best as a social safety net, right, to help supplement these stagnant wages and different things. So my question is this: like, I guess what could we do in this moment, right? Like, is it a question of, is it taxes? Is it investing in education? Is it, what are some things that we can shift policy wise that would help bridge this gap?
Well, there's not a lot we can do that's going to work overnight. We need things that are going to work gradually over time, because these are big problems.
Dan, we need quick fix.
Give me 2 days. What can we do in 2 days? No.
Well, given our nation's fiscal situation, we have to be looking at higher taxes anyway. Unfortunately, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act moved us in the wrong direction on that, both from an equity standpoint and also from a fiscal standpoint. So, you could just say, hey, we need to reverse that. That would be a step. I think that, yes, we do need things that start very early in life and work at the grassroots level, because I think one of the best things we can do is level the playing field for opportunity across the country. I am a big advocate for universal pre-K, also for universal school meals. These things have been tried in New York City, where I lived for a long time, and really have seemed to be making a huge difference. All the studies about them, going back to old studies about the Head Start program and stuff like that, have shown that these early childhood interventions make a huge difference later in life for educational attainment and earnings. So I think that if we can really try and level the playing field at the earliest ages, we're going to see that pay back in terms of economic growth in the future, and will probably pay for itself from a fiscal standpoint as well, because you'll get just higher taxes out of higher incomes. So that's one thing I would do. And of course, if you do have to fund that in the short term, yeah, it makes sense to raise some of the taxes on the high earners. In the past, I have advocated for a wealth tax as well, because wealth inequality is much worse than income inequality in this country. And I think wealth is really where the action's at, right? If you think of a bathtub, okay, like, your income is what's coming through the tap, okay? That's the flow. The amount of water in the tub is your wealth. That's the stock, right? And the thing that you look at to decide whether to get in the bath is not how fast the water's coming through the faucet. It's how much water is in the tub. So it's the same in our society. Wealth is what really determines access to opportunities. Wealth, not income. Income is the flow into your wealth, but wealth determines whether you can get into the country club, whether you can launch that political campaign, whether you can start your own business. Wealth is really the thing. And the way to correct wealth inequality has to be with some sort of wealth redistribution via the tax system. It's something that we don't think about very much. It's kind of abhorrent to a lot of people for understandable reasons, but that would be the fastest way to solve this big problem.
Yeah, we had someone on from a group called Patriotic Millionaires and talked about that very thing. Bob Lord was his name, and if anybody watching hasn't seen that, it's a really good episode. It's basically a bunch of really wealthy people who actually want to see the rich get taxed more, which would be great. So one of the things in the big One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which I cannot say, apparently it just doesn't really roll off the tongue. Another thing about that, while these big tax breaks for the wealthy were coming down, we also saw a new law which slapped a 1% tax on regular people who send cash via Western Union to their families overseas, which is an interesting dichotomy, I feel like, between those two things. Are we at a place now where that Washington's just going to squeeze pennies out of everybody they can while letting billionaires shield their wealth and just kind of do it without any desire to hide it or to pretend they're not doing it?
This has just been the leading strain of tax policy that one of the parties has advocated for now 20 years. has been to shift the tax burden from owners of capital to owners of labor, right? People who own companies to people who work with the sweat of their brow for a living. And we've seen it with the cuts in capital gains taxes. We've seen it with the cuts in income taxes, the carried interest exception, all these other tax breaks that high earning people can take advantage of for different forms of saving. We've really skewed the tax system against working people. And this is just another example. Yeah, maybe a slightly more barefaced one, and one that goes after immigrant populations especially hard, because they tend to be the ones who are sending those remittances. So, it's kind of all of a piece of what we've been seeing. It's just a little bit nastier and aimed at this particular population that this administration seems to have in its crosshairs.
So what would you say, because I've heard this argument before from, people basically saying, well, if you tax the rich, then those people are going to leave, right? So, and you could point to every tech billionaire in California who got out of here before they cashed out. So they went to Florida so they could save money in taxes. So why, if you hit the rich really hard, why wouldn't they just leave the country, right? Why wouldn't they just move their money?
We have a certain number of people in this country who are billionaires, but we have a much bigger number of people who want to be billionaires. And I don't think we're ever going to run out of them. And they're the ones who are going to be building the businesses, right?
Right.
If you're already a billionaire, great for you. You probably hit it rich with a couple of companies and you've done very well. But you're not spending most of your income, and you probably have run out of good ideas. So if you want to leave, then maybe that's fine. I feel like we want the billionaires who feel engaged with society, realize what society has given to them, how it set the stage for their success, and want to give back. Those are the billionaires I want to see stay in this country.
Do you think that we're going to see more of the Mamdani type people get elected, because of the fact that people are, angry? These working class voters are tired of it and they're getting frustrated. Do you think seeing things like freezing rent, free childcare, free bus fare, hiking taxes on the 1%, you think we're going to see more people kind of coming forward on a platform like this?
I think voters are looking for anybody who sounds like they might be able to help them.
Yeah.
We know that a lot of people who voted for Trump, who were sort of independent voters who voted for Trump in the last election, were Bernie voters before, Bernie Sanders voters. They were looking for somebody who was outside of the political establishment, who had a sort of populist slant that promised to help them. And these guys promised to help them in different ways, but they were promising the same thing. And so is Mamdani. You wonder why Mamdani went to the White House and came out all smiles with Trump. My theory is he whispered to him, our voters are the same people. And so, I feel like if you're a populist from the left or the right, you're probably promising the same things. And we probably will see a few more.
So, I guess, do you think that will actually, or can it shift things nationally, right? And I do think that grassroots where everything comes from grassroots, right? But do you think that this will push us as a country to expand our education, put more money in education, and do the things you're saying that will help us?
I am not quite as optimistic with education as I am with some other things, because understanding how education and early childhood interventions make a difference takes a real long-term view. And our time horizon in decision-making as consumers, business leaders, politicians has been getting shorter and shorter. So I have less faith in the idea that people will realize that we have to plant the seeds now for the economy 20 years from now.
Right.
I don't usually think like that.
Yeah, but there are other things that might be more promising. For example, people say everybody now is being shifted to become an independent contractor. It's harder to get benefits. And so that's why a lot of people are dependent on Obamacare. And that's why Obamacare subsidies are so important in these recent political debates. that's really an interesting transformation, right? Because we've gone from a situation where Obamacare was kind of rejected as socialist to a situation where Obamacare is essential because we have so many people who depend on it, and it's a growing number. And we're in this weird situation where by getting rid of employer provided health benefits, we're actually going closer to a national universal health system. And so I enjoy the irony of that, and I look for more examples where that might actually happen. So, we've got some folks who say, they're afraid that people are going to come with pitchforks. There have been some billionaires who've been warning about that for years too. And yeah, that could happen, but I think in this country, it's probably less likely. We haven't seen sort of, people raising the red flag and that kind of revolt. And I doubt that we will, just because of the history in this country and the attitudes people have. But we could see this evolution of understanding that certain types of a national safety net are more necessary now. And we even see people like Elon Musk suggesting that there will be a universal basic income in the future because there won't be as many jobs. Robots will be doing everything else.
Right.
So, it's weird because you can be from different parts of the political spectrum and sort of see where this is going.
Well, just the fact that you said that Bernie voters switched to Donald Trump is probably pretty crazy for most people to hear. It was crazy for me to hear. I mean, but I understand the idea is, of course, and that's, I think, what a lot of people miss about, when they're like, how did anybody, vote for Trump? I don't understand it. I don't understand it. I have this conversation with people all the time. And it's like, well, people looked at him as an option against the machine. And it wasn't, it doesn't seem that way thus far, but it definitely feels like that's where people's minds were.
Yeah, well, he said that prices were going to we're actually going to start falling, which almost never happens.
Right. Yeah. That's not gonna happen.
He promised lower prices for groceries and everything else. He promised lower housing prices. Mamdani is promising the same thing, different mechanisms maybe, but basically promising the same thing.
I wanted to point out real quick, somebody said in the comments, then what, as we're talking about this, why didn't they vote third party when people from the other parties are so obviously corrupt? We've had a couple people on the show talking about voter reform and how it really isn't, the deck is stacked against any third party or independent candidate. Do you have any kind of insight or any thoughts on why that is, why third party candidates aren't able to get any sort of momentum?
It is extremely difficult for third parties, and a big part of that is the financing of political parties. We have these two entrenched parties which have very well-oiled machines. They spend a huge amount of time fundraising, and they also have access to lots of government funds that help them. It's hard for a third party to get to that stature. And even if a third party manages to put up a presidential candidate, they don't have the other candidates across the country who are running on the same ticket, all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. If you looked at the way the politics are in this country right now, with a ruling party that's deeply unpopular, an opposition that also seems to be in disorder, you would say, wow, this is a moment like they had in France, where someone like Emmanuel Macron could come in with a third party and a whole slate of candidates and really wipe the floor with these guys.
Yeah, it seems ripe for it. It seems ripe for the opportunity right now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just extremely hard to do that in the US. We don't have a parliamentary system, so it makes it much harder to gain that kind of majority in one election. And we also have a Senate where we only elect 1/3 of those seats every couple of years. So it's very, very difficult to make that kind of change. We also have stronger state houses than the local governments in a country like France that wield a lot of power. So it's really difficult to do that in the US. And I think some people also remember, for example, the election in 2000, where they say, well, if nobody had voted for Ralph Nader, then Al Gore would have been president.
Right.
And they've kind of been burned by third parties. People from the other side of the spectrum might look the same way at the election of Bill Clinton when Ross Perot was a candidate.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah, Ross Perot was the other side. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People on both sides have kind of been burned by the third party. And now they're kind of saying, well, I'm loath to do that because I don't want to be a spoiler.
Yeah, and so it just ends up as lesser of two evils. They just truly go with the lesser of two evils. Yeah.
Yeah. I should say, though, that I'm not particularly envious of the countries that have 6 or 8 political parties, because they typically end up in parliamentary crises every 6 months trying to form governments and coalitions. It's a huge mess and a lot of wasted effort, but at least everybody feels like they have a voice.
So I am curious. So as an economist, because there are many different financial systems, right? Do you think capitalism is the best system if it had guardrails, or do you think there would be a better system?
Well, I wrote about this in Outrageous Fortunes, which is my last book, came out back in 2011. So you're forgiven if you haven't read it.
I'm from Alabama. I can't read, so yeah.
Hey, wait a minute.
I wrote in that book that neither capitalism nor socialism in their purest forms was workable. We had seen lots of problems, and even people who look enviously at the Chinese economy and how quickly they're able to build bridges and things like that have to understand that in exchange for that you get a lack of accountability, and so there really is no perfect system around the world. The excesses of capitalism are easily counted and categorized, so we know that capitalism in its purest form really is not a great system. If we had that right now, then we would probably lose a lot of our economic potential, because there would essentially be no safety net for people at the bottom. They would never have the opportunities that wealthy people would have, and all of their talents would be wasted. So we just know that from point of view of economic growth and potential, a purely capitalist, no holds barred system is probably not the best. We're seeing in Argentina right now, for example, a place where I used to live, an attempt, or at least partial attempt, to create a libertarian system that is as unfettered in a capitalistic way as can be. But that is deeply unpopular with a large percentage of the population that sees some of these risks as well.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it's basically, and I'm not asking you to give us the perfect system, but basically it would be a hybrid of, like, you have capitalism that has guardrails, and there is some socialism built in there to make sure that you have that talent that would otherwise be eaten up in a pure capitalist society, and it gives them the opportunity to rise up and actually be part of that economic machine. Is that
the SOCAP? The
SOCAP.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that's a decent description of it. I think that it's becoming more and more urgent for us to construct that safety net and to create that equality of opportunity, because of things like the K-shaped economy. We do risk losing a lot of economic potential, and that just makes the pie smaller for everyone.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We talk on this show a lot about change and whatnot. What do you see as a way forward for people who are listening to this show going, man, are we totally fucked, or do we have an option? Like, what kind of what kind of advice do you give to people on how to improve either their situation and to help improve the situation for everyone?
I don't want to generalize too much, because everybody's situation is different.
Sure.
Obviously, it's important to build your human capital, right? To learn new skills, new tricks, skills that are marketable in today's economy. Fortunately, it's easier than ever to do that. We have a lot of free online courses from major universities. We have things like Khan Academy, where you can go on and take courses in just about anything you want. Of course, it's not that easy to find the time for all these things if you don't have good childcare and you have to work 2 jobs. So it's a challenging time to have to do those things, but at least those avenues are still open to us. The other thing I would say is take that long time horizon. That's actually an advantage in our current economy. If you can be the one that has the long time horizon, who really has the patience to plan for the future, even if you're just setting aside $10 out of your paycheck every week and putting it in an index fund or whatever it might be, that's going to really pay off for you in the long term. You just have to have that small amount of discipline and that long time horizon to make it work.
Yeah, the long-term vision, I think, is something that we all struggle with. At least I shouldn't say we all. I'm not going to tell, but I do. I certainly do. Yeah.
I think it's human, right?
Yeah.
Not for China. I mean, I think someone was telling me China, they don't have 10-year plans. They have 100-year plans. They have 1,000-year plans. Like they literally have, centuries planned out in their economy and where their country's going. So they know how to do that.
I wouldn't put too much faith in that. You got to remember, they're a fairly young country the way they exist right now.
Yeah,
that's true.
And they've gone through plenty of 5-year plans that didn't go so well. But yeah, that long time horizon is a differentiator.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dan, I really appreciate, John and I both really appreciate you being here. The book, the initial book that we talked about, that's from 2011, is Outrageous Fortunes, that you can find everywhere. And you're writing a new book, or you've written a new book, and it will be coming out soon. Can you tease that for us?
Sure. It's coming out from Crown Currency in November. It's going to be called The Best Decisions You'll Ever Make, an economist's guide to saving time, making money, and living well. And what it does is it lets you in on all the tips and tricks that economists use to analyze decisions and make the best decisions they can. And it's based around 30 decisions in everyday life, from where to go to dinner to how to get the best price when you sell your house, to how you should split up your inheritances. So there's plenty in there for many aspects of your life. And along the way, it teaches you a lot of really useful tools.
That's awesome. I think we could all use that. I mean, there I go generalizing again, but I think we could. I really do.
Yeah.
I hope so.
All right. Well, thanks again, John. Anything to add before we go?
Daniel, this has been very informative. Thank you so much, man. I learned some stuff, and I'm a little more terrified, but like some hope in there too. So yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being on.
You're welcome. At least I came with a few solutions. I wasn't totally
You were totally, not totally out there, but
I hope I didn't ramble, but yeah.
Not at all. We appreciate it. And for everyone out there, thank you very much for joining us. Next week, we're going to sit down with civil rights attorney Erica Healy Kagan. She has spent her career on the front lines of the legal system, fighting for things as fundamental as just the right to have your identity recognized on a birth certificate, and protecting people from being fired just for who they are. We're going to talk about what's actually happening in our courtrooms, the human stories behind the headlines, and how we can move forward with a more empathetic way. So thank you again, and thank you all to everybody who commented and asked questions. We got some great stuff in here. A lot of people are just as worried as we are, and we're hoping that we can at least educate and have some good conversations with some amazing people like you, Dan. So thank you all. Thank you both very much. Thank you all for listening. Have a great night, everybody.